Stop right there. That was the last thing Danielle Carter heard before her world turned upside down. She was 8 months pregnant, just walking home with a bag of oranges. But Officer Kyle Reese didn't see a mother. He saw a threat, and in a split second of unchecked violence, he kicked her in the stomach and walked away like it meant nothing. What he didn't know? Her husband was Brandon Carter, a Marine veteran with a calm voice, a strategic mind, and a promise burning in his chest. You rest now, tomorrow is mine. What followed shook an entire city. This is the true story of a brutal injustice, a historic trial, and how one family turned trauma into a national movement. They didn't just fight back, they reshaped the system. You won't believe how far they went to get justice, not just for Danielle, but for everyone who's ever been told to stay quiet. Now, before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you. And now, let's get back to the story. Stop right there, he barked. I said stop. Don't make me repeat myself. Danielle Carter froze. The paper bag in her hand crinkled under her grip. Inside were a few oranges, Brandon's favorite, and a small tin of honey biscuits she'd picked up on her walk home from the library. The late afternoon sun in Riverdale cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and a warm wind rustled the pine needles overhead. But the moment Officer Kyle Reese shouted those words, the air turned sharp, thick with threat. Danielle turned slowly, cautiously. Her free hand moved her swollen belly. 32 weeks. She had counted each day like a prayer. A future was growing inside her. She wasn't running. She wasn't loitering. She was walking home. I'm just headed home, she said softly, the kind of tone she'd learned to use when speaking to men like this, low, non-threatening, apologetic for her very presence. But Officer Reese was already walking toward her, jaw clenched, one hand resting too close to his holster. His pale face was flushed, maybe from the heat, maybe from something colder. His patrol car idled behind him, its lights off but engine growling as if ready to pounce. You look like you're just standing around. Suspicious, he snapped. Danielle blinked. I'm not standing, I was walking. I work at the library down the road. I'm loitering, he cut in, standing on the sidewalk without purpose. The words echoed like a charge, like an accusation. She clutched her belly, feeling a flutter, her baby's kick, sharp and sudden. It was as if he could feel the shift in the atmosphere, too. I'm not arguing, Danielle said carefully, holding his gaze just long enough to show respect, but not enough to seem defiant. Please, I'm just trying to get home. But that word, please, lit something in Officer Reese's eyes. Not compassion. Something crueler, like the predator grin of a boy pulling wings off butterflies. I said stop moving. Danielle stopped, completely, her body locked into place like prey mid-flight. Her breath hitched. A trickle of sweat rolled down the back of her neck. He moved closer, and then, without warning, he shoved her. The bag flew from her hands, oranges bouncing across the pavement like marbles. She stumbled backward, trying to brace herself, but her balance was already compromised. Instinctively, both hands flew to her belly to shield her unborn child. Her heel caught on the edge of a sidewalk crack. She went down. Hard. Pain shot up her side as her knee struck the pavement, her shoulder slamming into the ground. She gasped, clutching her stomach, willing the pain to stop, praying her baby was okay. And then, it happened. A swift, brutal motion. Officer Reese raised his booted foot and kicked. Right into her belly. The sound wasn't loud, just a dull thud, soft, final. But Danielle's scream was. It tore through the street like a lightning strike, raw and primal. Her body curled inward, a mother's last desperate shield. She collapsed onto her side, hands locked protectively around her abdomen, eyes wide with disbelief and horror. And then came the stillness. People froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Onlookers blinked in disbelief. No one moved. A teenager pulled out their phone and hit record. A woman screamed, "She's pregnant! My God, someone help her!" Someone else shouted, "Call 911." Officer Reese? He just turned around, like nothing had happened. Like Danielle Carter wasn't a human being lying in agony on the pavement. The red light on the teenager's phone kept blinking. By the time the ambulance arrived, Danielle was drifting in and out of consciousness. Her thoughts were fractured. Brandon's face, her baby's kicks, the way the officer had turned his back on her, like she was less than trash. Each bump in the stretcher ride felt like fire ripping through her body. But what she couldn't let go of, what haunted the edges of her panic, was one name. Brandon. Brandon Carter. Her husband. He'd know what to do. He always did. At that same moment, across town at the Riverdale Veterans Resource Center, Brandon Carter was in the middle of his last counseling session of the day. A former Marine-turned-therapist, Brandon spent his days guiding fellow vets through the maze of PTSD, loss, and rebuilding lives. He never expected the call. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes? This is New River Medical. Your wife has been brought in. She's in critical condition. She's been asking for you." The phone slipped in his grip. "Critical? Wait, what happened?" There was a pause. She was assaulted by a police officer. Brandon didn't even hang up. He just ran. Out the door. Through the parking lot. Into his truck. The traffic lights were a blur of red and green. He barely noticed. His hands gripped the wheel hard enough to crack bone. The only thing that rang in his ears was the word, assaulted. And the baby. Oh God, the baby. By the time he arrived, his boots echoed across the sterile floor of the ER like war drums. He didn't remember parking, didn't remember getting out, just the crash of the ER doors and the panic rising in his throat. Room 403, a nurse pointed. He nearly crashed into a gurney rushing down the hallway. The walls swam, the antiseptic smell hit him like a punch. His hands trembled. He turned the corner and saw her, Danielle, bruised, pale, hooked up to machines that beeped like metronomes, counting down the seconds he could never get back. Her lip was split, her wrist was bruised, her stomach, he couldn't look. She turned her head slowly, tears lining the corners of her swollen eyes. "Brandon?" He was at her side instantly. "I'm here. I'm right here," he whispered, taking her hand. He kissed her knuckles, his own shaking. She whispered one sentence. "He kicked me." The air left his lungs. The soldier in him, the calm counselor, the man who had seen death and returned home whole, he shattered. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the bed. "What?" he asked, but he already knew. "He kicked me," she repeated. I told him I was pregnant, and he did it anyway." Brandon pressed her hand to his cheek, his face hot with fury and helplessness. His heart was roaring, his skin buzzing with fire. "What's the baby's condition?" he asked a nurse. "The heartbeat is steady," she said gently. "But we're watching for complications." Brandon nodded, jaw clenched tight enough to fracture teeth. Danielle winced. "Please, don't do anything reckless." "I won't," Brandon whispered. It was a lie. Because something in him had changed. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. About every black woman who had ever been told to stay quiet, to stay calm, to stay invisible. Brandon Carter wasn't going to ask for justice. He was going to bring it. Brandon didn't sleep that night. He sat in the stiff hospital chair, his back aching, knees bent, his gaze locked on the steady rise and fall of Danielle's chest. Her hand never left her belly. She whispered to the baby between pain and sedation, as if willing the child to hold on. Every so often, the monitors would beep in some new rhythm, and Brandon would lurch forward, his breath catching, his heart thudding like a war drum. But the real noise wasn't in the machines. It was in his head. The scene played over and over, except he hadn't even seen it yet. He didn't have to. Danielle's words had etched it into his mind with brutal clarity. Her crumpling to the pavement, the oranges rolling, the scream that tore through her throat, the kick. Brandon had seen things in war zones most civilians couldn't imagine. But this was something else. This wasn't some foreign battlefield. This was their street, their home. This was America. And it had declared itself, without apology, as hostile territory for his family. He pulled out his phone around 2:30 a.m., the hospital lights humming around him like low whispers, missed calls, dozens, text messages, hundreds. One notification stopped him cold. He kicked a pregnant woman like she was trash. Say her name, Danielle Carter. Posted with a shaky 40-second video, already shared 85,000 times. His thumb hovered over the screen. He pressed play. It began with Danielle walking. The sun was still out. Her silhouette looked so small, so peaceful, almost like any other woman just getting off work. And then, the patrol car, the shout, the shove, the oranges flying, the kick. Brandon flinched, not because he hadn't expected it, but because no part of him was prepared to witness the violence done to his wife. There was a gasp in the video, a woman yelling for help, a child crying. Brandon watched it once, then again and again. By the fifth time, his tears were gone. His expression was granite. He sent one message, Tariq Henderson. Hey, I need you. Civil rights case. It's big. It's personal. Tariq had once led their recon team overseas. Now, he was one of the top civil rights attorneys in Atlanta. They hadn't spoken in years. The reply came in under a minute. I'm in. What happened? Brandon responded with just one sentence. A cop kicked my pregnant wife in the stomach, and the whole damn world saw it. When dawn cracked the sky in hues of purple and ash, Brandon stepped out of Danielle's room and looked down through the hospital windows. He blinked. There were people on the steps, a dozen, then more. They were holding candles, signs. Justice for Danielle Black. Mothers are not threats. We saw everything. An elderly man in a church suit knelt and prayed. A group of young women from a local college stood together, arms linked. A nurse passed by and whispered, "It started with 5 candles around 10 p.m. There's over 200 now." Brandon felt the ache in his chest swell. But this ache wasn't grief, it was resolve. He walked back to Danielle's room. She was awake, sipping ginger tea. Her eyes were swollen, but clearer. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Feels like it." She reached out, took his hand. "You don't have to fix everything overnight." He sat beside her. "I can't sit still, Danny. I won't. I told you I wouldn't do anything reckless, but I didn't say I'd do nothing." She held his hand tighter. "What are you planning?" Brandon laid it all out. The attorney, the evidence, the pressure campaign, the demand for full accountability, not just for Officer Reese, but for every single person who buried his past complaints. He wanted the city to answer for every ignored red flag, every silence, every smug smile that dared to call itself justice. Danielle listened, nodding slowly. Then she rested her hand on her stomach and whispered, "Good, because I don't want our baby born into a world where this is normal." Brandon's eyes glistened. He nodded. "Neither do I." She looked at him again, her expression more serious now. "Promise me something. Anything. Don't lose yourself in the fire." He kissed her hand. "I won't." But his heart knew better. The fire had already started, and he wasn't backing down. By mid-morning, the video had over 3 million views. News vans arrived from Atlanta. The mayor's office issued a vague, tone-deaf statement. "We are aware of the incident and have placed Officer Reese on administrative leave pending investigation." Paid leave. Danielle lay bruised in a hospital bed, and the man who did it was still cashing a check. Brandon didn't wait. He called Tariq. "They're stonewalling. I want a press conference." "Already got it lined up," Tariq replied. "And I brought someone else in, Jacqueline Ayers." Brandon paused. "The civil rights hammer?" "The very one." Later that afternoon, on the hospital steps, Brandon stood before microphones, Jacqueline at his side, vigil candles still flickering behind them. The crowd gathered. Some held signs, others held each other. Brandon took a breath and spoke. "My name is Brandon Carter, and the woman in that video, that's my wife, Danielle. The baby she protected when she fell to the ground, that's our child." He paused, looked out into the sea of faces. "We were planning a life, arguing over baby names, painting a nursery, and one man with a badge tried to destroy all of that in seconds." He took a step forward. "We're not asking for revenge. We're demanding accountability. And if this city won't give it to us, we'll build the fire ourselves and drag the truth into the light." The crowd erupted. Jacqueline stepped forward. "We're filing a civil lawsuit, excessive force, civil rights violations, assault on a pregnant woman, and we're coming for every supervisor who protected Officer Reese, every complaint that was silenced, every system that let this happen." Brandon raised his hand. "This isn't over," he said. "It's just beginning." Inside the hospital, Danielle turned her head toward the window and smiled. The voice of the man she loved echoed beyond the glass. She knew the storm had only started, but for the first time in days, she felt something return. Hope. Brandon Carter stood in the middle of City Hall. No cameras, no press, no protest chants, just fluorescent lights, tired suits, and a thick folder clutched in his hand like a loaded weapon. He hadn't slept, he hadn't shaved, and he hadn't come to play politics. Across the sleek glass table sat Mayor Judith Halston, her hands clasped, her expression practiced. To her right, Police Chief Arthur Brandt stared down the bridge of his nose like a man hoping posture could camouflage guilt. 2 city attorneys flanked them, notepads open, pens twitching like nervous ticks. "Mr. Carter," the mayor began, her tone dipped in that syrupy blend of sympathy and condescension, "we want to express our deepest regret for what happened to your wife." To Danielle, what Officer Reese did is deeply troubling. Brandon didn't sit. He laid the folder on the table and met her eyes. "Troubling," he said flatly. "That's the word you're going with? Troubling is when your Wi-Fi goes out. What happened to my wife was a felony." The mayor's lips twitched. Chief Brandt leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Emotions are understandably high, but we are conducting an internal review. Officer Reese has been placed on administrative leave," Brandon cut in. "Paid administrative leave. So while my wife lies in a hospital bed, unable to roll over without pain, the man who kicked her is getting paid to stay home." Brandt's jaw flexed. The room tensed. Brandon slowly opened the folder and slid a single sheet across the table. "That's Officer Reese's disciplinary record. 3 prior complaints of excessive force in the past 5 years, 2 involving black women. All dismissed, quietly." One of the city attorneys reached for the document, scanning it. Mayor Halston's eyes lowered. "Some of these incidents predate my administration." "But not his badge," Brandon replied. "Not his hands." Another document slid across. "Here's an email chain from a former precinct captain recommending Reese for desk duty due to aggressive tendencies and inability to de-escalate. He was ignored, promoted instead." "Where did you get these?" the second attorney asked. Brandon leaned in. "From people who finally realized silence makes them complicit." Chief Brandt scoffed under his breath. Brandon turned. "Something funny, Chief?" Brandt straightened his tie. "You make it sound simple." "It is," Brandon said. "Do your damn job." A silence dropped like an anvil. Mayor Halston exhaled slowly. "What exactly are you asking for, Mr. Carter?" Brandon looked her dead in the eyes. "I want Reese suspended without pay. I want criminal charges filed, and I want every officer who signed off on burying those past complaints investigated for negligence." The mayor hesitated. "That's a lot to process. We'd need time to review." "You have 24 hours, Brandon said, voice iron. "After that, I go public with everything. Every name, every ignored complaint, every internal memo." One of the attorneys opened their mouth, but Brandon had already turned. "Don't worry, I'll let myself out." He didn't slam the door, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He'd already detonated the room. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks over Riverdale's skyline. Brandon stood still for a long moment on the city hall steps, breathing in deep, his hands steady. He wasn't just here for Danielle anymore. He was here for every person told to wait, every person told to file paperwork and trust a broken system to heal itself. He pulled out his phone and texted Tariq, "Meeting done. They're stalling, go wide." The reply came almost instantly, "Copy. I'll prep the press and legal fire." Jacqueline's team just subpoenaed the body cam footage. It's worse than the cell video. Brandon didn't flinch. Back at the hospital, Danielle was resting. A nurse had braided her hair. Someone had brought in flowers, sunflowers and white orchids, their soft petals bright against the pale linoleum. She looked peaceful, but Brandon knew the bruises beneath the surface hadn't faded. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice still soft. Brandon sat beside her and kissed her forehead. "They weren't ready, but they heard me." Danielle nodded. "You didn't yell?" "Good." A long pause settled between them, the kind of pause that lives between breaths during war. Then Danielle reached for his hand. "You still angry?" Brandon stared at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I'm focused." Later that night, Brandon, Tariq, and Jacqueline convened over Zoom. Documents piled high on the desk in front of them. A map of Riverdale's precinct network glowed on Jacqueline's second monitor. "This isn't just about Reese," Tariq said. "There's a pattern here. Reports going back over a decade. Complaints filed by women, ignored or lost. Internal investigations that mysteriously concluded without statements." "Let me guess," Brandon said. "Reese wasn't the only one." Jacqueline clicked a folder on her screen. 5 other officers. Same precinct, same behavior. One even transferred to another county after a suspension. No permanent record. Brandon exhaled through his nose. "A culture of cover-ups." "A breeding ground," Jacqueline corrected. "And we're just getting started." Brandon stared at the documents. His eyes burned from exhaustion. His body was aching, but his mind was sharp, a blade honed by rage and responsibility. "What's our move?" he asked. Tariq grinned grimly. "We light the damn fire." By morning, justice for Danielle was trending in every major city. Protesters marched down Main Street, church choirs led prayer vigils outside the police department, retired teachers, nurses, teenagers, vets, everyone was showing up. And in the middle of it all, Brandon stood tall, Danielle's name on his lips, her pain fueling his purpose. He spoke to the crowd again, this time with Danielle watching from her hospital room, a hand over her belly and tears in her eyes. "They thought we'd be quiet," Brandon told them. "They thought we'd move on. But let me be clear, we are not going away. We are not asking anymore. We're demanding. And if this city won't give us justice, we'll carve a new path ourselves." The crowd roared. The system, for the first time in years, trembled. And Officer Reese, he hadn't seen the worst of it yet. The sound of rain against the windows echoed like distant applause. Brandon Carter stood in the hallway outside Danielle's hospital room, his silhouette framed against the gray morning light. A nurse walked by, nodded respectfully. Another protest was gathering outside. From his vantage point on the third floor, Brandon could see the umbrellas forming a patchwork quilt of solidarity below. Reds, blues, blacks, all gathered not just for Danielle, but for what she now represented. Hope, resistance, change. He took a slow breath. His phone buzzed. A message from Jacqueline. "Need you in my office. Urgent. Come alone." 2 hours later, Brandon stood in the glass-walled war room that had become Jacqueline Ayers' legal headquarters. Whiteboards were covered in timelines, sticky notes layered across walls in chaotic brilliance, names, dates, scanned complaints, connections. The binder that began with Officer Kyle Reese had multiplied. Now it filled 2 entire tables. But it wasn't what was on the table that froze Brandon. It was what Jacqueline slid across the desk in a sealed manila envelope. "You need to see this," she said quietly. Inside were handwritten notes, anonymous statements from active duty officers in the Riverdale Police Department. "I've seen Reese slam people for speaking. I filed a complaint. It disappeared. Superiors told us, 'Don't touch Reese, he's protected.'" Brandon stared down at the pages. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the cold, cutting realization. "They knew," he muttered. "They all knew, and they let him keep hurting people." Jacqueline nodded grimly. These statements matched the exact patterns from 5 prior excessive force complaints, all swept under the rug. Internal affairs didn't just fail, they colluded. Brandon's jaw clenched. "I want every name," he said. "Every officer who filed a false report. Every supervisor who buried one. I don't care how high it goes." "It goes high," she replied. "That's what you need to know." "The mayor? She's not just stalling, she's protecting the chain of command. And it's not just Riverdale. We've started cross-referencing neighboring counties." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "You think this is bigger?" Tariq entered, holding another printout. "We don't think. We know. This is a statewide rot." He slapped a spreadsheet on the desk. 4 officers from different counties. Same MO. Repeat complaints. Same outcomes. Quiet reassignments. No consequences. Brandon folded his arms. "And they still get to wear the badge." "Not for long," Jacqueline said. "But we can't just blow the whistle. We have to build the case so airtight they can't squirm their way out." Brandon looked around the room. "What's the next step?" Jacqueline's eyes were steel. "We go public. Not with rage, with receipts. We're not just filing a lawsuit, we're peeling back the whole damn system." That weekend, Rosa organized a town hall meeting in a church basement. They expected 30 people. They got 300. Fold-out chairs filled the room, and even then, people stood along the walls and crowded the doorway. Elders, students, mothers, fathers, pastors, mechanics, each with a story. One by one, they spoke. An older man named Mr. King Whitmore described being shoved face first into a squad car for walking too slow on his way home from church. A young mother shared how her 15-year-old son was thrown to the ground during a traffic stop because his hoodie was up in the rain. A retired teacher said quietly, "We stopped reporting it years ago." No one ever listened. Brandon sat silently beside Jacqueline and Tariq, taking it all in. By the end, his hands were clenched so tightly they'd gone numb. Danielle's attack had been the match. But the fuel? It had been building for years. Monday morning, Riverdale woke to news vans parked outside City Hall, the police precinct, and Jacqueline's office. The Carter lawsuit had become national news. CNN, MSNBC, even BBC had picked it up. Not just because of what happened to Danielle, but because of what was happening now. Momentum. Tariq stepped up to a press podium that afternoon and addressed the city directly. This is no longer a matter of one bad officer, he began. This is a matter of systemic rot. We have statements, we have documentation, and we have names. He paused. Either this city takes action, or we do. He dropped a thick file onto the podium with a solid thud. Reporters surged forward. Questions flew like sparks. Brandon stood behind him, eyes unflinching. He wasn't just a grieving husband anymore. He was a threat to the system, to silence, to the way things had always been. Later that night, back at the hospital, Danielle was sitting up in bed for the first time since the attack. Her hand still rested over her belly. The bruises on her cheek were fading, but the shadow in her eyes hadn't gone away. Brandon walked in. She smiled weakly. They said you were on the news again. He sat beside her, kissed her forehead. They also said, we're starting a movement. Danielle reached for his hand. Then let's make it count. They sat in silence for a moment. Then she whispered, Brandon, are you scared? He considered the question, then shook his head. No, I've been to war, but I've never been this ready. The courtroom was packed, not for a trial. Not yet. This was a preliminary hearing, routine by every legal standard. But there was nothing routine about the energy inside the room. You could feel it in the silence, in the way the gallery breathed as one, in the way people stood straighter, eyes sharp, shoulders square, like this was church, and they'd come not to worship, but to witness. Brandon Carter sat in the front row, his arm around Danielle, who wore a black maternity dress and a soft scarf to hide the still visible bruising along her throat. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned. Across the aisle, Officer Kyle Reese sat with his attorney. He wasn't in uniform this time, just a gray suit that didn't quite fit and a jaw so tight it looked like it might snap. For the first time, the world saw him not as the man in power, but the man on defense. The video was played again on a large screen with every gasp, every scream, every second in high definition. Danielle walking home, the stop, the accusation, the shove, the kick, her scream. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Danielle didn't look at the screen. She kept her eyes on the judge. Brandon didn't watch the footage either. He watched the jury of public opinion, the gallery filled with clergy, students, veterans, grandmothers, artists, and bus drivers. He watched their expressions shift from horror to rage to resolve. When the video ended, the prosecution statement was short and devastating. This was not a mistake. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate, violent act against a woman who posed no threat, committed no crime, and pleaded for peace. Officer Reese was not afraid. He was emboldened. The defense tried to argue Reese feared for his safety, that Danielle had resisted, that the context was unclear. But no one in the room believed it, because now they'd seen what happens when the badge becomes a weapon and fear becomes a shield for cruelty. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. By sunset, it had tripled. The video had gone viral again, this time spliced with the courtroom footage and Brandon's words at the hospital steps. They thought we'd go quiet, but they kicked the wrong woman. That line had become a chant, a hashtag, a battle cry. Every news station picked it up. Every city felt its tremor. And somewhere, in some other city, another woman watched it and whispered, I'm not alone. That night, back at the hospital, Danielle lay in bed with the lights dimmed, her hand slowly stroking her belly. Brandon sat beside her, watching her breathe. You okay? He asked. She nodded slowly. I didn't break on that stand. No, you didn't. She turned to him, her eyes misty. I was scared, B, but then I thought about every girl who'd never get the chance to speak, and I knew I had to. You did more than speak, he whispered. You roared. She smiled faintly. You remember what you said that night, after the ambulance? He nodded. You rest now. Tomorrow's mine. Well, she said, tomorrow came. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. The mayor's office tried to hold emergency meetings. Community leaders demanded Reese's arrest. State officials began poking around. The Riverdale Police Department issued a hollow statement of concern, but the public had already decided. The thin blue wall was cracking. And Brandon? He didn't stop. He met with legislators. He sat for interviews with Black-owned media, college newsrooms, podcasters, and community radio. He didn't chase headlines. He chased truth. And every time someone tried to change the subject, he brought it right back to Danielle. to their unborn child, to the sidewalk where it all began. Then the threats started. First, a letter slid under his office door. Back down, or we'll bury you in more than paperwork. No name, no return address, just fear, written with shaky hands. Then came the online smear campaign. Fake social accounts claiming Danielle was lying, that the video was staged, that Brandon was profiting off victimhood. Brandon read every comment, then shut his laptop. He turned to Tariq and Jacqueline and said, "Now I know we're close." A week later, they held a press conference on the hospital lawn. Jacqueline stood tall at the podium. "This lawsuit is moving forward, but it's not just about Officer Reese. It's about every person who covered for him, every file that vanished, every case that went ignored." She held up a folder thick with signatures. "This petition has over 100,000 names, people demanding not just justice for Danielle Carter, but reform for every city like Riverdale." Brandon stepped forward next, his voice calm but cutting. "Let me be clear," he said. "We are not angry. We are awake. We are not violent. We are vigilant. And we are not waiting anymore. You cannot fix a system by hoping it heals itself. You have to expose it, uproot it, rebuild it." Danielle watched from a wheelchair nearby, her hands resting on her belly. When Brandon looked at her, the crowd followed. And suddenly the image was everywhere. A black woman, bruised but unbroken, holding the future in her arms, and the man beside her, no longer just a husband, a leader. Later that night, as they watched the press coverage from her hospital room, Danielle turned to Brandon and asked softly, "You still sure this is what we're meant to do?" He didn't hesitate. "We're not just doing it for us," he said. "We're doing it so no one else ever has to." She nodded, then smiled faintly. "You know," she whispered, "they really did kick the wrong woman." Brandon took her hand and whispered back, "And now the whole damn world knows her name." To be continued in Part 6. Would you like me to keep going with Part 6 now? For you said, continue. ChatGPT said Part 6. This isn't a case, it's an infection, and we're cutting it out at the root. The city tried to wait them out, tried to weather the storm with polished statements and backroom whispers. But Brandon Carter didn't let up. Neither did Danielle, and neither did the truth. Inside Jacqueline Ayer's law office, the walls were now papered with proof. Internal memos, complaints that were lost, audio from whistleblowers, even body cam footage that had been tampered with. Every new piece of evidence didn't just paint a damning picture of Officer Kyle Reese. It revealed something far worse. A blueprint, a system, a culture that not only allowed abuse but expected silence. And Riverdale? Riverdale had become ground zero. "This isn't a case," Jacqueline said one night, standing in front of a dozen reporters. "It's an infection, and we're cutting it out at the root." Back at the hospital, Danielle's condition had stabilized. The baby's heartbeat was strong. Doctors were cautiously optimistic. But trauma doesn't only settle in the bones, it settles in the spirit. Danielle still flinched when someone knocked too hard on the door. Still gripped Brandon's hand a little tighter when a uniformed nurse walked in. One afternoon, she sat quietly, watching the ceiling. "Sometimes," she said, "I still feel his foot, like it never left." Brandon turned from the window, walked to her side. "I know," he said, sitting beside her. "That's why I'm not letting go of this." Days turned into weeks. Then came the message that would shift the battle once more. It was a text from a number Brandon didn't recognize. "You don't know me, but I was one of Reese's former supervisors. They buried what I wrote. I have the originals. Meet me. I'll show you what you're really fighting." Tariq and Jacqueline vetted it. The man checked out, a retired sergeant, once demoted and reassigned after trying to file an internal report. Brandon met him in a dim coffee shop on the edge of the county. The man was in his 60s, face tired, hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a worn folder. Inside, original documents, not digital, handwritten, signed, date-stamped. "I told them he was a problem. I wrote it down. I said it in meetings. I even warned internal affairs. They told me to let it go. Said Reese had friends in high places." He looked up, eyes clouded with guilt. "And I did let it go, until I saw what he did to your wife. I saw her face on the news, and I knew this was my fault too." Brandon didn't speak. He just reached out, took the folder. "Not anymore," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Back in the war room, Jacqueline's team scanned the documents, cross-checked signatures, verified timestamps. It was the smoking gun. With it, they filed a motion for expanded discovery, demanding the city turn over all internal communications involving Reese and his supervisors over the last 10 years. The city tried to block it. The court overruled them. Now the floodgates were opening. Meanwhile, Danielle, finally discharged, had returned home under careful observation. A nurse checked on her daily. The nursery remained unfinished, but there were signs of hope again. Paint swatches taped to the wall, baby name books on the nightstand, her favorite record playing softly in the background as she sat in the sun, hand resting on her belly. Brandon came home one evening and found her smiling. "Something good happened today?" he asked. She nodded. The baby kicked, strong. He knelt down beside her, rested his hand gently. The baby kicked again. Brandon closed his eyes, letting that small movement settle into his soul like sunlight breaking through a war-torn sky. "I think they know," he whispered. "Know what? That they're being born into something different, something we built." But building meant breaking old walls. And that night the system pushed back again. Someone vandalized the Carter home, spray paint across the garage door. Liar. Stop the lies. Fake victim. Brandon found it at dawn. He didn't call the police. He called a painter. Covered it before Danielle could see. But the message was clear. They were being watched, intimidated. And it wouldn't stop there. That same day, building inspectors showed up at the Veterans Center Brandon ran. Suddenly, it was out of code. Power was mysteriously shut off. A pipe accidentally burst. Every move reeked of pressure. Quiet retaliation meant to make him fold. But Brandon had been in war zones, and this was just noise. He called the press. Let the cameras see the shutdown. Let the public see how far the system would go to silence truth. Then came the next wave of defiance. Brandon announced a bold new move, the introduction of a policy proposal named after Danielle, the Danielle Carter Act. It would mandate independent oversight boards for police misconduct, require body cam footage be released within 48 hours of any use of force incident, strip qualified immunity from officers with repeated complaints, create trauma response teams separate from police intervention for expectant mothers and vulnerable civilians. Brandon wasn't just fighting anymore, he was legislating, and the people were behind him. City Hall panicked. Mayor Halston requested a closed-door meeting. Brandon agreed, but this time he brought Tariq and a reporter from the Riverdale Times. No more secrecy. In that glass-walled chamber, the mayor leaned forward, tired, her hands clasped. "We're doing what we can, Mr. Carter." Brandon cut her off. "No, you're doing what looks good on paper. There's a difference." She sighed. "We need to move carefully. Too much change too fast will invite backlash." "You're not afraid of backlash," Brandon said calmly. "You're afraid of accountability." The room went still. "What do you want?" she asked. Brandon stood. "I want Reese fired, indicted. I want the department cleaned out. And I want you to admit publicly that the system failed." "That's bold," the city attorney muttered. Brandon turned. "It's overdue." He didn't wait for applause when he left. He didn't need it. Because outside, the people were already clapping. The courtroom was colder than expected. Not the air. The air was still. But the silence, the way it wrapped around every wooden bench and marble tile, felt like the hush before a lightning strike. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Students, clergy, activists, police in plain clothes, local reporters with notepads, national outlets with cameras mounted just outside the courtroom doors. Some watched from overflow rooms. Some live-streamed from phones tucked between their knees. And there in the front row sat Danielle Carter, her face calm, her posture steady, her belly rounded beneath a soft navy dress, her hand resting protectively over the life inside her. Beside her was Brandon, hands folded, eyes locked forward. This was it. The trial of Officer Kyle Reese had begun, and for once the entire world was watching. Reese sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit and a stare that refused to meet Danielle's. Gone was the smirk, gone was the badge. What remained was a man cornered by consequence. The prosecution opened with the video, again. Only this time, it wasn't grainy footage on a phone. It was blown up on a 90-inch screen in high definition. The jury watched every frame, Danielle walking, the officer approaching, the shove, the fall, the kick, her scream, the silence that followed. No one blinked. When Danielle took the stand, the room shifted. Not because of drama, but because of grace. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She told the story the way truth demands to be told. Calm, honest, unshakable. "I was walking home," she said. "I'd picked up oranges. My husband loves them." She paused, hand moving instinctively to her belly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I told him I was pregnant. I told him I was going home." Her voice caught, just once, and he kicked me. Gasps rippled across the gallery. I remember thinking, I'm going to lose my child on the sidewalk, in broad daylight, because someone with power decided I didn't matter. She turned her head slightly, looked directly at the jury. "I'm not here because I want sympathy. I'm here because I survived, and I don't want another woman like me to lie on the ground hoping the camera catches her scream." The defense tried to break her down. They brought up Reese's years of service, his commendations. They argued he feared for his safety, that Danielle had moved suddenly, that he perceived a threat. But the jury wasn't buying it, because the video didn't lie, and neither did she. When Brandon took the stand, he didn't deliver speeches. He delivered facts about Danielle's injuries, about the trauma, about what it's like to sit in a hospital room for 3 nights not knowing if your child will survive. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His presence did the work. And his last words stayed in the room long after he stepped down. "He didn't just kick my wife. He tried to crush a future. But we're still here, and we're not leaving." The prosecution rested their case with quiet power. The defense stammered. The jury deliberated. 3 hours, and then, verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Kyle Reese, guilty on all counts." The room exhaled. Danielle trembled, not from fear, but release. Brandon caught her hand, squeezed it gently. Across the courtroom, Reese sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to inhale air he'd no longer been given permission to breathe. The word guilty echoed beyond the courtroom, through the streets of Riverdale, through the halls of every police department that had ever looked the other way. And for the first time in years, justice wasn't a promise. It was a verdict. The sentencing came a week later. The gallery filled again. No cameras this time. No fanfare. Just presence. Danielle gave a victim impact statement, standing with quiet grace. "I should be planning a nursery," she said, "not court appearances." Her voice didn't shake. "I forgave you, Mr. Reese, but that doesn't mean I forget. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. Because if there aren't, who's next?" The judge's sentence was clear. 5 years, no parole, badge revoked, pension stripped. And with that, the door began to close behind Kyle Reese, for good. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Microphones reached. Brandon helped Danielle down the steps, one arm around her waist, the other shielding her from the chaos. But this time, she stopped, turned, and stepped forward. "I didn't think I'd ever see this day," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But here we are. This verdict wasn't just for me. It's for every woman who's been silenced, every mother who's walked home afraid, every voice that was almost erased, not anymore." And then she turned back to Brandon. He took her hand, and they walked on. In the weeks that followed, the Carter Justice Foundation was officially launched. Not just an office, a movement. Free legal aid for families impacted by police violence. Mental health services for trauma survivors. Community-organized town halls for reform proposals. And in the heart of that movement, Danielle and Brandon, shoulder to shoulder, not just surviving, but rebuilding. One morning, Danielle sat before a group of teenage girls in a community center, young, pregnant, scared. She looked around the room and said, "I was lucky, my baby lived, but I shouldn't have had to fight that hard just to make it home." One girl raised her hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for not giving up." Danielle smiled. "That's why I'm here. So you don't give up either." The Carter baby was born on a quiet Sunday morning. Brandon held him for the first time and whispered, "You're safe now." They named him Justice, not because of what they won, but because of what they were still fighting for. The neighborhood block party started just before dusk. The sky over Riverdale bloomed in soft watercolor hues, peach, lavender, deep gold. Folding chairs lined the sidewalk. Long tables groaned beneath trays of food, ribs, cornbread, collard greens, homemade pies. Kids ran barefoot through sprinklers, their laughter rippling louder than any headline. A gospel choir began warming up in the church courtyard, harmonizing under string lights swaying in the breeze. At the center of it all stood Brandon Carter, holding his son, Justice, strapped to his chest in a soft carrier. The baby blinked at the world with quiet curiosity, his tiny fists curled, as if even now he was still holding on to the fight he survived before he was born. Danielle stood nearby, wearing white for the first time in months. Her face, once pale from pain, now glowed with quiet strength. Her hand waved gently as neighbors approached, some strangers, some old friends, many with tears in their eyes. "Y'all didn't just survive," one woman whispered. "You changed everything." Jacqueline Ayers arrived next, slipping through the crowd like a general in civilian clothes. "I brought the policy draft," she said, handing Brandon a folder. "The Carter Justice Foundation is officially backing the Danielle Act. We're submitting it to the state committee this week." Brandon nodded, flipping through the pages. Independent police oversight boards, mandatory release of body cam footage within 48 hours, trauma response teams, qualified immunity restrictions, and training reforms in high-bias precincts. Jacqueline smiled. "This isn't symbolic, it's surgical." Brandon looked over at Danielle, who was now surrounded by a group of teenage girls, young mothers who had driven from hours away just to see her, just to thank her. "This was never just about us," Brandon said. "No," Jacqueline agreed. "It's about what comes next." At sundown, the choir began singing "We Shall Overcome." Brandon stepped up to the microphone. He didn't speak immediately. He let the stillness settle. "Then, I used to think justice was something you waited for," he said. "A verdict, a press release, a public apology. But now I know, justice isn't just a destination. It's a decision, a practice, a promise you make to keep showing up, even when the spotlight fades." He looked down at justice, now sleeping against his chest. "I named my son after it, not because we won, but because we refused to stop fighting." The crowd clapped, slow and steady. Some wept, some raised fists, all stood still. Danielle stepped beside him. "We didn't ask for this fight," she said, "but we're not walking away from it either." In the following months, the Carter Justice Foundation grew. They opened their first community legal clinic. They launched trauma counseling programs for families affected by state violence. They held town halls, not just in Riverdale, but in neighboring cities, rural counties, and even colleges. One by one, they trained new leaders. Youths, grandmothers, pastors, paralegals, teachers, vets. And everywhere they went, someone would stop them and say, "I saw the video, but your story gave me hope." Danielle found her own calling, too. She partnered with doulas and maternal health nonprofits. Launched a podcast titled Still Standing, where she interviewed Black mothers about childbirth, fear, and healing. She started a peer network for women who had survived trauma at the hands of police or the healthcare system, because she knew what it meant to feel like a statistic in a hospital gown. She told her story again and again, not to relive it, but to rewrite the ending for others. One afternoon, Danielle sat with a nervous 17-year-old in a clinic waiting room. The girl's name was Maya. She was 6 months pregnant, alone, and terrified. "You look like you've been through it," Maya whispered. "I have," Danielle smiled gently, "but I'm still here, and now I'm here for you." She took Maya's hand, and for the first time that day, the girl breathed. Meanwhile, Brandon was invited to speak at a state law enforcement leadership summit. Some said it was a trap, that the room didn't want to hear from him. But Brandon went anyway. He walked in alone. No entourage, no podium, just his voice. "You don't fix a broken machine by oiling the loudest gears," he said. "You take it apart, bolt by bolt. You examine every crack, every leak, every silence, and then you build something better." Some officers squirmed in their seats. Some crossed arms, but one raised a hand afterward. "I don't agree with everything you said," the man admitted. "But I heard you," Brandon nodded. "That's where it starts." At home, life settled into a new rhythm. Justice learned to crawl, then walk, barefoot and bold, always moving. He had Danielle's eyes, Brandon's calm, and something else, something intangible. A gravity, a quiet presence, like even now he was listening. One evening, Brandon watched him toddle across the living room, a crayon clutched in his hand, leaving gentle streaks of color on the cardboard boxes that still held case files from the lawsuit. Danielle laughed. "Should we stop him?" "No," Brandon smiled. "Let him draw on the past. Maybe that's how we'll finally paint something new." On Justice's first birthday, they held another block party. But this time, there were no cameras, no reporters, no chants, just music, laughter, life. Danielle held Justice in her arms as Brandon spoke. I've spent the last year learning that justice isn't an endpoint. It's a beginning. It's every step you take when the world tells you to sit down. It's every time you speak, even when your voice shakes. And sometimes it's just surviving long enough to speak at all. He looked at the people around him, then at his son. We didn't win because we beat the system. We won because we showed them we wouldn't disappear. And now we're building something that will outlive every bruise, every scar, every headline. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the lights glowed warm across the block, Danielle and Brandon stood together, hands intertwined. "We made it," she whispered. Brandon looked at her, then at Justice, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. "No," he said, "we're just getting started." A year had passed since Danielle Carter was kicked on a sidewalk for walking while pregnant, and yet the air in Riverdale felt different now. Not just because of verdicts or headlines, but because something deeper had shifted. The silence that used to follow acts of brutality had been replaced by voices, clear ones, loud ones, determined ones. Danielle and Brandon Carter were no longer just survivors. They were builders. And the thing they were building, the Carter Justice Foundation, was no longer a vision. It was a living, breathing engine of change. Their office space in downtown Riverdale hummed with life. Volunteers sorted paperwork, attorneys met with clients, outreach teams trained local residents on their rights. There was a whiteboard behind the front desk filled with photos, notes, and sticky pad reminders. Some were updates on ongoing cases. Others were quotes from community members. All were reminders of why the fight began. But Brandon's favorite part wasn't the board, it was the people who walked through the front door. The ones who came in slowly, uncertain, carrying a silence that had hardened over years. And the ones who walked out taller. One of them was Clarence Hayes, a retired mechanic who had lost his son to a traffic stop that went wrong 7 years prior. No charges. No body cam footage ever released. He sat in the foundation office with his arms folded, eyes rimmed red. "I stopped talking to folks about it. Didn't want to be the man who couldn't move on." Brandon nodded slowly. "You didn't move on, Mr. Hayes. You just waited for someone to listen." For the next hour, he did just that. Meanwhile, Danielle was leading an entirely different kind of revolution. Her maternal health campaign had expanded beyond Riverdale. She had partnered with doulas, midwives, and hospital networks across the state. Her voice, once quiet and unsure, was now sought after by medical conferences, university programs, even Senate subcommittees. She wasn't just a former victim. She was now a policy advisor on Black maternal safety. One afternoon, she stood in a crowded auditorium filled with nursing students. Her tone was soft, but there was no mistaking her authority. "I almost died on a sidewalk because no one saw me as human, because they saw my skin before my pregnancy, my clothes before my intentions, my silence as guilt." She paused. "But I'm still here, and so is my child. And now I fight so you never become the nurse or the officer or the administrator who says, 'I didn't know.'" The students stood, some clapped, some cried, all listened. Justice Carter was now nearly walking on his own, toddling through the halls of the foundation office like he owned the place. He would tug at pants legs, point at charts, giggle at law books. To the outside world, he was just a child. To Brandon and Danielle, he was the living, breathing reason they hadn't stopped. They were raising him in a world they were actively reshaping, with every case, every training session, every petition, every town hall. Justice wasn't just a name, he was a mission. But not everyone welcomed the change. With visibility came retaliation. One morning, Brandon walked into the foundation and found the windows cracked. Inside, someone had spray-painted a phrase across the wall. "You think you're heroes, you're just noise." Danielle arrived moments later. She stared at the words, then walked straight to the reception desk. "Paint over it," she told the staff, then print it on a poster. "Hang it in the front lobby." Brandon tilted his head. "Seriously?" She nodded. "Because they're wrong. We're not noise." She looked at the young intern holding the paintbrush. "We're the sound the system never wanted to hear." That afternoon, they held an emergency community meeting. Dozens of supporters filled the building within the hour. Some brought flowers, others brought food, but most just brought presents. One retired judge stood up and said, "I watched this family turn pain into purpose. If you want to break their spirit, you'll need more than broken glass. You'll need to break all of us." applause, tears, unity. Later that night, Danielle and Brandon sat on their front porch, watching Justice sleep inside on the couch. "You know," Danielle whispered, "sometimes I miss who we were before all of this." Brandon looked at her, thoughtful. "I do too, but I wouldn't trade who we've become." A beat passed, then she asked, "Do you think it's enough?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand. "It'll never be enough," he said. "But it's a beginning." That week, they hosted their first statewide Carter Justice Summit. Over 600 people attended from across educators, lawyers, survivors, students, clergy. The keynote speaker? Not Brandon, not Danielle, but a woman named Maya, the same young mother Danielle had mentored months earlier. She stood on stage holding her baby girl, voice shaking as she began. "I thought I was alone until she found me. I thought I was broken until I saw what survival looked like on someone who refused to break. And I'm here to say, I believe in this movement, because it believed in me first." As she walked off stage, Danielle met her at the edge of the stairs. They hugged, and in that moment, the torch passed, quietly, powerfully, permanently. At the close of the summit, Brandon addressed the crowd one final time. "We built this because we refused to wait. We refused to be defined by what was done to us, and we refused to accept that justice only belongs to the powerful." He looked out at the sea of faces. "You don't have to have a law degree or a microphone to make change. You just need courage and company, and a reason you'll never back down." He paused. "For us, it was a kick. For you, it might be something else. But whatever it is, use it." He nodded once. "And when they ask what happened in Riverdale, you tell them they didn't just spark a protest, they started a reckoning." Autumn returned to Riverdale with golden leaves spinning gently across sidewalks that once held pain. The same sidewalk where Danielle Carter had once been brutalized now led to a mural, a towering, full-color tribute painted on the side of the Carter Justice Foundation's headquarters. It showed Danielle standing strong, her pregnant belly glowing with light. Beside her, Brandon, holding baby Justice high in his arms. Above them, in bold script, "They kicked the wrong woman, and she stood for all of us." A local news anchor described it as the single most powerful piece of public art in Riverdale's history. But for those who knew the story, who lived it, the mural was more than art. It was testament, a marker in time that said, "We were here. We were hurt, we healed, we changed everything." That same week, Brandon was invited to speak at a National Justice Reform Summit in Washington, D.C. He stood on stage in front of mayors, police chiefs, senators, and nonprofit leaders. He didn't bring charts, he didn't recite policy, he brought his story. And theirs. "Danielle was just trying to get home," he said, his voice steady, eyes locked on the crowd. "She didn't ask to be a symbol, she just wanted safety, dignity, a future." He paused. "And when that future was nearly stolen, we didn't beg for it back. We built it ourselves." Gasps, stillness, applause, and then silence again as he delivered the final words. "We didn't just survive the system, we reshaped it. And if we can, so can you." Back home, Danielle had just put Justice down for his afternoon nap. She walked the quiet halls of the foundation, stopping at the wall of names in the front lobby. Families they'd helped, lives they'd honored, justice they were still chasing. Some had found peace, others were still fighting. All of them mattered. Her phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "Spoke at my old high school today. Told them everything. 3 girls stayed after to ask how they could help others. One of them's thinking of becoming a lawyer." Danielle smiled. She thought back to that moment on the sidewalk. The oranges rolling, the sirens, the scream. It should have ended her. Instead, it made her unstoppable. That night, she and Brandon tucked Justice in and returned to the porch, where warm light spilled out onto the steps and the street beyond shimmered in orange lamplight. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we stayed quiet?" Danielle asked softly. Brandon nodded. "Every day." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "But we didn't." "No," he whispered. "And now people are speaking up because they saw us survive." She laughed gently. "We did more than survive, Brandon. We built." He nodded, and they sat in that silence. Heavy, holy, earned. Weeks later, news broke that the Danielle Carter Act passed both chambers of the state legislature. Signed into law by the governor under the flash of cameras, reporters crowded the steps of the Capitol. But Brandon and Danielle weren't there for fanfare. They were home, helping a young father file his first civil rights complaint, holding the hand of a grieving grandmother who'd lost her grandson to another routine stop, training their staff on a new initiative to track statewide use of force incidents. Justice, now running full speed through the office halls, paused only to offer crayons to every adult he passed. Each time, he handed them the same color: gold. In a quiet moment before the office opened one Monday morning, Brandon stood in front of the mural and whispered, "We never wanted to be heroes." Danielle stepped beside him. "We just wanted to come home." They both stared at the painted version of themselves and the light blooming behind them. Epilogue. Justice Carter turned 3, the day his parents hosted a community summit that brought people from 9 different states to Riverdale. His mother introduced a panel on maternal health. His father unveiled a new partnership with 3 law schools for free legal advocacy. And Justice? He grabbed the mic at the very end of the night, looked at the crowd and said proudly, "My mama's brave. My daddy makes people strong." The crowd laughed, cried, applauded, because the truth was, he wasn't wrong. In the end, they didn't just change the law, they changed the culture. Danielle and Brandon Carter proved that trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of your legacy. And sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with sirens. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a mother rising from the pavement, a father refusing to be silent, and a child named Justice, smiling at the future his parents refused to give up on. Sometimes the world tries to bury us, in silence, in fear, in injustice. But Danielle and Brandon Carter showed us that even when the system fails you, your voice can still rise. Your truth can still matter, and your fight can change everything. Because justice doesn't just happen in courtrooms. It happens in living rooms, in hospital beds, on sidewalks, in community halls. It happens when someone says, "Enough." So if this story moved you, if you believe in building a better world, one voice at a time, then don't let it stop here. Like the video. Subscribe to our channel. We share real, powerful stories like this every week. And drop a comment below. What does justice mean to you? We'd love to hear your story. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay strong, stay brave, and stay loud.